Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are going to change gears now, and we are going to be talking about the policy and the ethical issues. So I am Immaculada de Melo-Martin. I am a professor of medical ethics at Cornell, at the medical school. And we are having two speakers now, as we did before. Each of them is going to have a different presentation. The first speaker is going to be Dr. Matthews. You have already met her. She is a fellow here in Science and Technology Policy at the Baker Institute, and she's going to be talking about the U.S. policy landscape, what are some of the history of this 14th day rule, and some of the implications of that rule from the policy point of view. Our second speaker is Dr. Iltis. She's a professor of philosophy and the director of the Center for Bioethics, Health and Society at Wake Forest University, and she's also a non-resident scholar here at the Baker Institute. And she's going to be actually talking about the ethical issues, the different ethical issues that arise in relation to research with embryos. So without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Matthews.
So hello again, and I guess you'll see the slides that we started with before, but this is the presentation that they're for. All right, so what I really want to walk us through is kind of a little outline, and thank you, Dr. Bravonalou, for your beautiful photos. We're going to talk about the current U.S. policies. I'll give you kind of an overview of what's right now, what impacts human embryo research. And then we're going to take a step back and talk about how we ended up here, some of the different ethical committees and ethical discussions that have gone on since IVF discussions started. We're going to also take a step and look at state policies, because not only are you impacted by federal policy, but the states that you live in also could have things and rules which impact how long you can do and how much research you can do on human embryos. We're going to also look at civil societies, and by this I mean non-governmental organizations, scientific and medical societies, and other private funders of research. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit of an overview of the different challenges. So if we decided that this wasn't the appropriate guidelines, what are the things, what are the hurdles you would have to go through in order to change it? So I'm framing with the policy, and it'll be followed up by Dr. Iltis, will tell us of whether or not, or what are the questions about whether or not we should be doing research. So to really frame it, I thought the first place we should start is by really defining what an embryo is, and to contrast what we look at in the government versus what scientists look like. And some might argue about the specific details of this, but generally we think of the embryo as starting as a mass of cells at the earliest stage of development. And in the human, this is usually the fertilization through about 8 weeks of gestation, about 56 days. At that point, we refer to it now in terminology as a fetus, and that goes through birth. So this definition doesn't line up perfectly with the U.S. government. Our government doesn't have an official embryo definition, but it does define a fetus, and the fetus is a product of conception from implantation until delivery. So obviously, it starts a little bit earlier in the federal government, their definition of a fetus. So we have to keep that in mind when we're having discussions about this. But in addition, I think that policy looks at things, the difference between in utero, so what's happening in the womb in a person, they use the word implantation, versus ex utero, what would happen in a lab. So again, the same quote as before, it's a product of implantation. And then there's a lot of research on our human subjects guidelines that impact fetal research. So they must enhance the well-being or meet the health need of the fetus, or it must pose no additive risk to suffering, injury, or death of the fetus. So that's what you're seeing when you actually have it in utero, but ex utero and lab, we don't really see the same kind of oversight. If it's not implanted, which I would argue that Dr. Bravonalou's research is not implanted into a woman, it's not in a uterus, therefore it doesn't follow under what we now have codified as human subjects, and doesn't have the same level of regulations or rules and guidance on how they get cultured. There is another piece of legislation, and for those of you who are familiar with embryonic stem cell research should know this one really well, because we talk about it a lot, but there is a limitation on federal funding for human embryo research and embryonic stem cells, and that's from the Dickey-Wicker Amendment. And that piece of legislation says that none of the funds can actually be used to create a human embryo. Again, some language you see similar, that could, whether the embryos are destroyed, discarded, or knowingly subjected to risk of injury or death, greater allow for on a fetus. And then they have a good definition in this law about what they say the embryo is, that includes all various means of actually creating the embryo, including fertilization, parthenogenesis, etc. So it's pretty inclusive, and we pulled this one from the last federal budget that was passed, an omnibus bill. It is actually passed every year, so this isn't a permanent rule. It's actually, in a sense, temporary. It's just associated with the budget for the Department of Health and Human Services, and has been passed every year on every budget since 1996. It first showed up in 1996 during a big omnibus bill. 96 was when all the federal government closed down. Some of you might remember. I think Neil was there, had extra work to do, and when they finally passed the budget bill that year, they had put this into place. It specifically, so organizations within NIH, it covers, within Department of Health and Human Services covers NIH, which was one of the largest funders of biomedical research in the US, the CDC, FDA. I would also note that a lot of times it's on an omnibus bill, which means it's a bill that has a bunch of different departments, so it actually is a little bit broader in those cases of all different areas of federal government, and sometimes I think even the first time, I think it was a one big bill for almost every agency. It actually did impact every agency. But mostly I think we're discussing as the NIH, which is where I think a lot of this research would normally be funded, and includes new projects, so you cannot actually apply for a grant for this research. Use of facilities, supplies bought with federal funds are also impacted, so you will be using other funds, state funds, private funds, in order to do your research. I would say that after this is passed, NIH really hasn't had a strong player participation in a lot of the ethical guidelines for embryo research. It actually didn't set guidelines for embryonic stem cell derivation in research until it was allowed by the federal government to do so in 2009, which we'll kind of touch on briefly. So it doesn't review grants, and it doesn't give guidelines anymore on it. But this Dickey-Wicker Amendment does not impact non-federal funds. Again, state and private funds aren't impacted by it. They don't have their own rules. They are making their own rules as they go, which is why we're actually going to discuss those separately later. So how did we end up here? So we're going to walk through a bit of a timeline history of some key issues and time points that start out from I chose the 70s, since that's where IVF started. But I actually started out a little bit earlier than IVF to point out the National Research Act, which was passed in 1974. It was adding more ethical guidance for human subjects research, and specifically within the law, they mentioned that it allowed embryo research, but required that this research be approved from an ethical oversight board. And I'm going to use two different terms back and forth. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare turned into the Department of Health and Human Services in the late 70s, early 80s, and so it kind of goes back and forth, but those, for our purposes, are the same organization. So in 1978, we finally saw a grant go through NIH. It was a group from Vanderbilt University that was interested in doing some IVF research. It got approved from NIH, but it triggered this ethical oversight board to be created. Also of note was that it's also the same year that IVF was successfully completed for the first time. Louise Brown was born in the UK through IVF. So this ethical review board that was created started and had meetings in 1979, and it had 13 members and 2 consultants, interesting, all white males. It was chaired by 2 individuals, Gaither and Hamburg. Note, Gaither came in as a lawyer, and Hamburg was actually the president of the Institute of Medicine at the time. They hosted 11 meetings across the country, which I found actually fascinating because they actually visited locations all over the country. They didn't host meetings in DC, they actually hosted meetings in Kansas City. I believe they went to Chicago, they went to the West Coast. They got a lot of oral testimony. People submitted written testimony to them. They poured over these documents, and they made a series of recommendations for the research and released a report, which this is the cover of, in 1979. So the report itself unanimously found that human embryo research was acceptable from an ethical standpoint. So what are the goals of the report? Was all recommendations were actually unanimous, and this is one of them. but they did acknowledge that embryos had a special status, specifically saying that the board in agreement that the human embryo is entitled to profound respect, but this respect does not necessarily encompass the full legal and moral rights attributed to persons. So they, in addition, made some recommendations for research, what should and should not be done, which we'll talk about in a minute. But they avoided discussing federal funding. Specifically, they weren't interested in being the one to tell Congress whether or not there should be money allocated towards this. They felt that that would be from somebody else. So the specific guidelines they came up with first started off with is making sure that everything is in compliance with current regulations. This is, if you noted, this is the same one as all the other references we've had for fetal research, for instance. Second, they wanted to make sure research was designed first to establish safety and efficacy of IVF, so it was very focused what research they were interested in funding or allowing. And second, to obtain important scientific information that cannot be reasonably obtained by other means. So you should do it only using human embryos if you cannot do the same research using another source of cells. They wanted to make sure there was consent of the gametes from both sides, I think consistent with some of our human subject rules. And then they also said that no embryo should be sustained in vitro beyond the stage normally associated with completion of implantation or day 14, being our kind of really first policy recommendation to suggest the 14-day rule. There's a little bit of discussion, and I think one of colleagues who's here wrote a nice book who brought in a lot more of the discussion that happened after to tell us why they picked day 14, but the report isn't as detailed, I think, as they did afterwards, tell us afterwards of why they picked that day. And lastly, they wanted to make sure, because it was so new, that if there was any risk associated with IVF, that it was informed the general public. So a thoughtful set of recommendations, I would say. But unfortunately, these never really turned into law. They were never actually codified. What happened was, in 1980, Carter decided to fire most of his cabinet, including the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. So he was in charge of watching through and guiding this particular process. When he left, a new secretary came in. That's actually when they got the new name. That secretary didn't actually know what this review board did. There was another ethics advisory committee that was a presidential advisory committee that was also in place, and they thought they did the same thing, so they moved all the money over to the other one, and because there was no money for the EAB, it ended up being disbanded and never met again. So they made this one report and didn't have a chance to review any other projects or do any other research after that. So the guidelines were never fully adopted within Department of Health and Human Services, and no research has been approved. Fast forward, we went through 3 administrations that were heavy Republican. Key things that happened during this time was that we then had our first IVF baby that was in the US in 1981. Later on, in 1984, the Warnock Report, which is a seminal report from the UK, they looked at this specific issue as well, looking at IVF and whether or not there should be IVF in the UK, and whether or not there should be research. They came up to a slightly different conclusion, and now there actually is an authority, an agency in the UK called the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority that oversees licensing for IVF research. And then later on, it became embryonic stem cell research, human embryo research, all of that fits under. So you have to go and apply for it. But they upheld the 14-day limit within their guidelines. That's the limit they created as well. And they also spent a little bit more time in their report saying why the rationale for that particular point in time. The UK is also well known for also disseminating a lot of their recommendations when they do stuff like this, these seminal reports. And so a lot of times this is actually the link back to most people's knowledge of the 14-day rule, and was used to help create, I think, and especially when embryonic stem cells came around, perpetuated those guidelines within other countries as well, I would say. But no policies were changed, or guidelines were actually changed within the Reagan and the George H.W. Bush administration. During Clinton's administration, one of the first things that happened was that there was a new act for NIH, the National Institutes of Health Revitalization Act, was passed. This was something that a Democratic-controlled Congress had been trying to pass for several years and finally got through when they had a Democrat president. And one of the pieces in there was actually removing the oversight of the EAB. They said, if you're not going to fund it, if we're not going to recreate it, why do we need to have it anymore? So it was removed, which allowed for NIH to start actually funding human embryo research again if it chose to. So what happened was Clinton, with the director of NIH, created a new panel to kind of look through the ethics again, because again, 15 years had passed, and this is the Human Embryo Research Panel. So like the other panel, this had a collection of members, but they did actually bring in a little bit more diversity. There were women in this one. And they brought in actually a nice really group of different backgrounds in order to kind of approach the issue. It was a 19-member panel, and they were charged to advise on ex utero human embryo research, what NIH should fund, what it should not fund, and what are things that maybe it should actually have under a more strict review of whether or not it should fund. They convened a series of meetings between February and October, 6 public meetings. I believe all those were actually in DC. And then they came up with a series of recommendations. Differently, their recommendations weren't necessarily unanimous. The report is unanimous, but the recommendations were based on the majority and not unanimous. So it's slightly different from how the last one did it. So first, the recommendations, including the support for human embryo research. They said, although the pre-implantation embryo warrants serious moral considerations as a developing form of human life, it does not have the same moral status as an infant and child. So very similar to what we saw in the previous panel from the Ethics Advisory Board. They also upheld the 14-day rule, but they did make an exception in the category of warranting further review, perhaps allowing more research a little bit beyond that, especially doing research through day 18, looking at the closing of the neural tube. They recommended federal funding more specifically than the other panel did, and they also recommended funding research that involved creating human embryos for research. So this last one actually, here's the specific quote. They said studies that require fertilization of the human egg are needed to understand crucial questions in reproductive medicine. It would therefore not be wise to prohibit altogether the fertilization and study of oocytes for research purposes. They released a report in December of 1994, and the very next day, President Clinton said that he didn't approve of it, this particular recommendation. He did not like the idea of using federal funds to create human embryo research. He said in a press release, I do not believe federal funds should be used to support the creation of human embryos for research purposes, and I have directed that NIH not allocate any resources for such research. Interesting enough, during this actual same press conference, I think there was a positive from this Ethics Advisory Committee, because that's also when he announced he was going to form his own Ethics Advisory Committee that later became the National Bioethics Advisory Council. So NIH accepted the remaining of the recommendations, so everything except for creating embryos for research or federal funding embryo creation. But the human embryo research was never actually funded, because by the time the process of going through submissions and review process, we get back to the Dickey-Wicker Amendment that we talked about previously, again passed in early winter of 1996, banning human or federal funding for human embryo research. Some people have pointed and think that this was a direct relation to actually having made that recommendation, and the first report caused Dickey-Wicker to actually kind of be more proactive to create it. But this is actually part of our political landscape now, and again, it's still part of what we see in our federal budget each year. I also wanted to point out this is the Presidential Advisory Committee that Bill Clinton created, and they did some publications and research and studies that overlapped with this area. In 97, they did Human Cloning Project, so that was after Dolly was created, the first mammal cloned, and they just mentioned that there had already been this commission and they didn't talk about it at all. And the second one in 1999 for human embryonic stem cell policy, they did uphold the 14-day rule in that particular one. And I believe they also said they decided they shouldn't use federal funds for creating a human embryo in those recommendations. But the policy never changed or moved. There are some small things that are just kind of aside, but slightly related to this area. So I think some people are aware for embryonic stem cells, there was a limitation placed by George W. Bush. He had run on the platform that he didn't like any human embryonic stem cell research because it destroyed a human embryo in the process. But then later on, in August 9th of 2001, did a public address and said, okay, I have a new executive order. It means everything that was created prior to this point we can use for research. but no new lines could be used for federal funding. And that stayed in place until the next administration. He also created his own Presidential Council on Bioethics, which was his ethics advisory committee. They touched on the 14-day rule and their report in 2004 on reproduction and responsibility, specifically just talking about it being a consensus now internationally at this point. There seems to be some general agreement among scientific professional societies that embryos should not be cultivated beyond 14 days. They also pointed to non-governmental governments across the world having them, and that this is probably a good time point. The Obama administration also didn't really change anything and have much of a discussion about human embryo research. He did sign an executive order removing the limitations from George W. Bush on human embryo research, in the sense that the lines could be created at any time, but then put a series of guidelines on actually that you must follow in order for them to qualify. And those lines specifically from leftover IVF eggs, so ones that are reused for reproductive purposes, and then they're left over and then used for research, and not ones created for research purposes. So the Trump administration, where we are now, really hasn't had a lot of comments or discussions about this. I tried looking through his Twitter account. I didn't notice this but there's a lot on there, so I might have missed something. One note they did add to the mission statement for the Department of Health and Human Services that their services start at the beginning at conception, which was new, something that they'd added in recently, and that was in, I think it was in September 2017. It was done by the secretary then, Tom Price, I think a few days before he got ousted for spending a lot of our money to travel on personal vacations. So we have a new Secretary of Health and Human Services, and he hasn't had any public comments about this as well. I do want to point out that science perhaps is not a big priority for this administration. There currently is no science advisor for the president. So traditionally, there is a science advisor who works in the White House as an assistant to the president, as well as the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is a side project that Dr. Lane and I work on with one of our postdocs. So if you have more questions, we can talk about this ad nauseum. But there's no one actually currently, and this has actually been the longest, I think, in several decades, at least dating back through Reagan, where a science advisor hasn't been appointed at this point. But he did actually keep our director for NIH and NSF, which I think is a positive. Francis Collins was a holdover from Obama, as well as Franz Cordova, so a very highly respected scientist. So I'm shifting gears slightly so I can give you a quick survey of what's going on in the US, because I think this policy will impact us as well. So 21 states in the US, the ones shaded in gray, have no policies on the book that impact human embryo research. The ones in green actually have some permissive policies where they're encouraging research, and usually they actually as well have a 14-day limit with it. And red, we have 11 states that I think are explicitly, in our interpretation, restricting human embryo research. A lot of times they are kind of do no harm. They might say explicitly all human embryo research and other types of bans, but it really covers it pretty extensively. There's another 14 states which seem kind of questionable. It was kind of interesting as we reviewed through these. You could probably do embryo research in these states, but they do have really limiting policies on embryonic stem cells for some reason. And the way they wrote it or abortion or fetal research or human cloning. There's other things in there that they were actually banning, but when you read it, you could actually still do human embryo research within the state, whether they intended to or not. And then when we look at a survey of what's going on outside of the government and nonprofits and science organizations, for instance, quite a few of them have held up the 14-day rule, including the International Society for Stem Cell Research, that specifically bans in vitro culture of any intact human pre-implantation embryo beyond 14 days or formation of the primitive streak, which occurs first. In addition, the national academies, when we did a survey, we found that the ban was placed in there within their guidelines for embryonic stem cells, but we do not see any kind of deliberation. There's never been them reporting specifically looking at this issue in itself. That could be because the first committee, again, had the president of the Institute of Medicine on board, so perhaps that's why they didn't feel they had to say anything at that point. And then we surveyed some other societies. These are kind of more professional ones that have had the 14-day limit at some point or currently do. The American Society for Reproductive Medicine used to be the American Fertilization Society, and they spent some time actually putting together a report where they upheld the 14-day limit. And the other two have either had it on their website at one point, although now I can't find it, or they have been quoted in the press as being supportive of it. And we also did a survey of funding organizations. Most of them don't talk about human embryo research. We tried to search out the ones we thought would be more obvious, more likely to have funded embryonic stem cell research, so maybe it would be in place. The ones that we did find tend to either uphold the 14-day rules, but the vast majority just linked over to the National Academy's guidelines, saying we'll follow that guideline. And here's an example of the Christopher Reeves and Dana Reeve Foundation. Now think back, this is actually Christopher Reeves was paralyzed in our Superman from the movie series. His foundation did a lot of work on neural cells in embryonic stem cell research. And as you see here, they specifically talk about, yes, there's balancing issues, and we believe the National Academy's guidelines is what we're going to do. And this is what we saw a lot when we actually could find something on their website about it. So the last few minutes, I'm just going to walk you through what changes and what the possibilities are and what are going to be hindering if you actually want to make a change to this policy. So on the federal level, I think with my survey, I think it's kind of apparent there isn't necessarily anything that's going to actually stop you from it, which is why actually Dr. Bovanoglu has been able to do his brilliant work within the U.S. in his particular lab, because he's not using any federal funds, so therefore he is actually fine. The Dickey-Wicker Amendment has been discussed. Maybe we should drop it. But again, you have to remember it's been used since 1996. We've gone back and forth between presidents that were Republican and Democrats in that time, as well as Congress majorities, Republican and Democrat. It stayed with each administration and each change, so it's not likely to actually be dropped, I would say. State policies kind of were, again, a big patchwork, a map of different things going on a state-by-state level. Some of them would be quite easy. Texas actually has no state policy, so that would be quite simple to do it. California, while it's been permissive, does have the 14-day rule, so they would have to go back and make a change. I'm not sure if I have to look, or off the top of my head, I don't remember if that's actually legally or if it's in the guidelines they did afterwards, so that depends on how difficult it is. Other very restrictive states, and I see less likely for North Dakota, for instance, to change because they do not do any embryonic stem cell research there or any human embryo research. When we're looking at the non-governmental organizations, I found obviously these could be simpler to change in a sense because you just need a majority and a consensus among the population with it. You're working with the professionals, the scientists, etc. I do believe this is probably the place that would actually shift the change if you wanted to do it. So scientific and medical societies would probably need to change first in order to push a change, probably on a federal level, state level, and definitely if you wanted to get funders, the organizations and funding society that are funding the research to change their policy to allow more research. Everything pointed, especially with those that they were leaning towards, for instance, the national academies. And then I wanted to kind of hint on this because Dr. Bovanoglu also mentioned as well. There is a question about whether or not there is a gap in policy with using these synthetic embryos, gastroloids, embryoids, and they do raise ethical questions, which I'm just totally punting to Dr. Iltis. The 14-day rule might cover or might not cover it, but then again, it's not a federal guideline rule, so it probably depends on the interpretation of the locale or whatever the regulations are for you. So before I ended, I like this quote from Leroy Walters. He's talking about, I think, embryonic stem cells at the time, but it applies for this and quite a lot. As one lesson is that ignoring a public policy problem does not make it disappear. So I think having these discussions and kind of continuing the conversation to figure out what is the appropriate one is always a good thing. And with that, I'm going to close and leave for the next session.
Good morning. I want to thank the many people at the Baker Institute for their hard work in putting this together. And also, what did I do? Something interesting. Oh, look at that. Okay. And also the Greenwall Foundation for its support of this project. So this presentation is based on a report that I wrote together with Dr. Robert and Dr. de Melo-Martin, and I will ask them to join us for the Q&A as well. So the structure of this symposium and of our report says something important. We have gathered people from different disciplines and professions, as well as members of the public, to contribute to the discussion of embryo research. And we've done so because scientific questions arise in the social context. They're not merely scientific questions. This context includes economic, political, religious, ethical, and scientific concerns. And scientific inquiry, importantly, requires public trust, and often scientists seek public support in the form of research dollars through taxation, private support, often in the form of tax-deductible contributions, as well as legal and regulatory structures that are favorable to science. Scientists alone cannot determine what counts as good science, important science, science worth doing, science we should pursue, or science the public should support. Nor can it tell us all by itself what rules and regulations should apply to science or how we should identify them. In a world of limited resources, we have to prioritize our spending. And we, in this room and certainly outside of this room, will disagree about which of the many good things we could do is most important. And the controversy, though, runs deeper, and that's where we are today. Sometimes we don't simply rank goods differently. Instead, we disagree about whether some lines of inquiry should be pursued at all, because either the goals or the means to pursue them are unacceptable. This is where we find ourselves with embryo research. Some object to all embryo destructive research. Others maintain that at least some research on embryos is permissible, yet they disagree about how to distinguish the permissible from the impermissible research. And others think all of this research should be done because of the potential knowledge to be gained. So our ethics report reviews the scope and the significance of these disagreements with regard to the 14-day rule. We focus primarily on factors that might affect embryo research beyond 14 days, since this is where recent policy discussions are concentrated on broadening rather than restricting embryo research. But while we do that, we acknowledge that this does not mean that everyone thinks research up to 14 days on embryos is morally permissible or that it's universally acceptable. Disagreements about the moral status of human embryos are central to assessing the permissibility of embryo research. Thus, much of our report focuses on presenting a range of views about the moral status of human embryos. But this is not the only relevant consideration. Other considerations include the possibility of advancing knowledge that could improve human health, concerns about equity, access to future therapies, and the role of egg or ova providers in embryo research. So before I get to an overview of our discussion, just a little bit about terminology. We use embryo in the way that Dr. Matthews described it earlier in the scientific terms. And I'll say a little bit more about sheaths, or what Dr. Bervanelou referred to as gastruloids. These are complex cell assemblies that strongly resemble human embryos, while not actually being human embryos as usually defined. They do not result from the fertilization of an egg cell by a sperm cell. These entities are sometimes called synthetic human entities with embryo-like features, sheaths or gastruloids. We use the term sheath in our report, and I'll say a little bit more about them later. So we'll begin with just the definition of moral status. We said moral status claims are often important in these discussions. So we'll use this this is what we use in our report. To have moral status is to be morally considerable or to have moral standing. It is to be an entity towards which moral agents have or can have moral obligations. If an entity has moral status, then we may not treat it in just any way we please. We are morally obliged to give weight in our deliberations to its needs, interests, or well-being. Furthermore, we are morally obligated to do this not merely because protecting it may benefit ourselves or other persons, but because its needs have moral importance in their own right. Moral status does not entail anything about what interests or rights an entity has, how those rights or interests might be identified, how significant they are, or how much consideration they deserve, whether they impose absolute restrictions on others' actions, or whether we have any strict positive obligations toward them. All that having moral status entails on this definition is that the needs, interests, or well-being of the entity in question must be taken into account for its own sake. Knowing what an embryo is scientifically will not, by itself, tell us whether it has moral status or what may or may not be done to it. A scientific description is just that. For instance, scientific descriptions of various animals do not tell us whether or not we may eat them, how they ought to be treated while they are alive, and whether, when, or how they may be used in research. There's a spectrum of views about the moral status of the human embryo. For example, a human embryo is not something different in kind from a human being, like a rock or a potato or a rhinoceros. A human embryo is a whole living member of the species Homo sapiens in its early stages of her natural development. Unless severely damaged or denied or deprived of a suitable environment, an embryonic human being will, by directing her own integral organic functioning, develop herself to the next, more mature developmental stage, the fetal stage. The embryonic, fetal, child, and adolescent stages are just that. Stages in the development of a determinate and enduring entity, a human being who comes into existence as a single-celled organism, a zygote, and develops, if all goes well, into adulthood many years later. And I think in the presentations from this morning, some of the pictures that Dr. Ravanalou had posted, he said, look at, if you can see it, I think there was a day 6 one that was this beautiful sort of globe with colors, right? You can see this is a very early picture of yourself. Right? That's the idea. It's a continual stage of development on that view. Some people think an embryo has some moral status. For example, the special status of the human embryo and the protection to be afforded to it by law do not, in our view, depend upon the decision as to when it becomes a person. Clearly, once that status has been accorded, all moral principles and legal enactments which relate to persons will apply. But before that point has been reached, the embryo has a special status because of its potential for development to a stage at which everyone would accord it the status of a human person. And then there's this view. The moral status of the human embryo is determined by its possession of those features which make normal adult human individuals morally more important than sheep or goats or embryos. It is clear that at no stage of its development does the human embryo, nor yet the human fetus, possess these characteristics. Although scientific descriptions of the embryo are not sufficient to determine moral status, they are relevant. Insofar as certain biological characteristics are thought to be necessary or sufficient for moral status, for example, science can help us determine when embryos have the characteristics in question, or when they come to acquire them. Significant disagreements exist about what characteristics are necessary and or sufficient to confer moral status. Even when scholars agree about the fact that one or more particular characteristic confers moral status, sometimes they disagree about whether or not embryos have them. Differences also exist about what it is about these particular characteristics that make them appropriate grounds to confer moral status. And I think you heard a little bit of that hinted at in our previous discussion. So a few caveats before I get into this discussion. Our goal is simply to show the scope of the debate and the significance of these views for assessing the permissibility of human embryo research and for developing relevant policies. At this stage, we are not attempting to resolve those debates. Second, our discussion is not exhaustive. We present the main accounts that have shaped the literature. So there are 5 grounds that we discuss in our report. First is species membership. Being part of a species, such as the human species, whose members typically have sophisticated cognitive capacities, is a necessary and or sufficient ground for having full moral status on this view. Even when a particular entity, such as a human embryo or an adult in a coma or a significantly cognitively disabled individual, does not have those significant cognitive capacities, it's still thought to have full moral status in virtue of being one of us. Given that human embryos are human and not frogs, rocks, apples, elephants, and so on, based on their genetic makeup, they would be considered to have full moral status. Some commentators hold that a necessary, though not necessarily sufficient condition or requirement for having moral status is that an entity be a unique individual. Before the primitive streak appears around 14 days, twinning is possible, and thus some have contended that an embryo before the 14th day cannot be a unique individual. Others note that even if an individual might twin, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a unique individual. That possibility alone does not foreclose being an individual. A third possible ground for moral status is certain kinds of physical characteristics. And here, any number of things might be conditions for having full or partial moral status. So some examples of physical characteristics that could be important are the beginning of neural development, or perhaps a later stage of neural development, or some would say being viable. Until an entity can live outside the womb on its own, it doesn't have moral status. Moral status, whether it's full or partial, might require any one of a number of cognitive capacities. So this is a fourth ground. Sentience, for example, is the mere ability to experience pleasure or pain. Others might say, no, you need more sophisticated cognitive capacities such as self-awareness or the capacity to set goals or the capacity to value things, or something somewhere in between might be held. Sentience arises in fetal development somewhere between 18 and 25 weeks post-fertilization, and so it's not present in embryos, nor do embryos have these more advanced capacities. The term capacity raises some interesting questions. Although many agree, look, embryos lack significant, sophisticated cognitive capacities, right? They look at the picture of the cells. They can't think the way we can think. They can't value the way we can value. Others have said, now hold on a minute. I think we're moving too quickly in talking about what it is to have capacity. If we think that having sophisticated cognitive capacities is required for having moral status, and we think that people who are sleeping or under anesthesia have moral status, then we must think that they have sophisticated cognitive capacities. And that must mean that we recognize that just because a capacity cannot be exercised at this very moment doesn't mean that you don't have the capacity. So if people for example, under anesthesia have the sophisticated cognitive capacity required for having moral status, then embryos have it too. It's just that they can't exercise it right now. Another ground for moral status has been the claims around potentiality. Some commentators hold that an embryo need not actually have whatever physical or cognitive characteristics we think are important for having moral status. It's just that they have the capacity, the potential to develop those capacities or those characteristics. And again here, some people have said, now hold on, when we talk about potentiality, we need to be careful. Some scholars have argued that embryos that are, for example, left over after in vitro fertilization that will no longer be used for reproductive purposes, or embryos that have been created specifically for research purposes, lack the potentiality since they will never be transferred for gestation. Philosophers can create a problem wherever they find something, right? Regardless of what conclusions we come to regarding the moral status of the human embryo, a further question concerns what may we do to them? Determining that an embryo has moral status only tells us that its interests matter morally, to some degree, for that entity's own sake. It doesn't tell us how much they matter or what they entail. So in the report, we consider the implications of different accounts of the moral status of the human embryo, the things we've just gone through, for the question of whether or not the 14-day rule should be extended. A major factor in exploring these implications is the extent to which other moral considerations are relevant to the permissibility of embryo destruction. This turns in part on how strong we think the presumption is against destroying entities with varying degrees of moral status and the kinds of reasons, if any, that could justify such destruction. In general, people agree that at a minimum, having moral status involves a strong presumption against acting in certain ways towards the being in question, such as destroying it. If embryos have full moral status, then society has a strong reason not to destroy them, even if doing so can provide us with valuable knowledge that might eventually save the lives of other human beings with full moral status. Nonetheless, some people think that in some narrow cases, such a reason might be overridden, but we disagree about exactly which cases would count. So how claims of full moral status affect the possibility of extending the 14-day rule depends on what individual characteristics ground moral status and when an embryo comes to acquire them. For example, some argue that species membership is sufficient grounds for full moral status. From that point of view, it doesn't matter that an embryo has hit 14 days or not. Embryos have full moral status from the time that they become embryos, from the time of fertilization is what people typically say, and this would give us a stringent moral reason against destroying them for research purposes. That position would have little effect on the 14-day rule. If embryos have full moral status from the moment of fertilization, and embryonic research at any stage of development would involve destroying an entity with full moral status, then it would be morally impermissible, whether it's before or after 14 days. There might be pragmatic reasons at that point for introducing a limit, but it wouldn't be that the 14-day rule marks a moral boundary. Having a lesser degree of moral status means that we have some obligations not to interfere with the embryo, but we might hold that other interests or goals outweigh that obligation more often than if the embryo has full moral status. How claims of partial or lesser moral status of the human embryo would affect the permissibility of extending the 14-day rule depends on at least two things. First, the characteristics that confer some but not full moral status. And second, the moral assumptions about what it means to have moral status and what may be done to entities with this sort of partial moral status. For instance, it might be that an embryo having some moral status would give others a reason not to destroy it, but that maximizing the common good by gaining valuable knowledge would override such a reason. Conclusions about the moral permissibility of extending the 14-day rule when embryos are thought to have some degree of moral status might take into account issues such as how significant the knowledge to be acquired after day 14 is and whether there are other ways to secure that knowledge, which will become an important issue in talking about sheaths. Most accounts of what confers some degree of moral status would have little effect on debates about extending the 14-day rule. Take, for example, potentiality. If having lesser moral status involves a strong presumption against killing that is not overridden by considerations of the common good, then research with embryos would be morally impermissible at any stage of the development. Right? Just if having the potential to be the kind of being like us is what gives you partial moral status, then that doesn't change at the 14-day mark or at any other mark. The 14-day rule and its extension just wouldn't affect those judgments. Some of those who support research on human embryos believe that embryos do not have even partial moral status. They claim that embryos lack any of the characteristics that plausibly could confer moral status, such as sentience or certain cognitive or emotional capacities. So here, the 14-day rule is of little significance. To the extent that having moral status is thought to be the most relevant consideration against destroying embryos or against embryo experimentation, then extending the 14-day rule would be morally permissible. Indeed, for some commentators, extending the 14-day rule is morally obligatory because of the kinds of knowledge that could be gained. Nonetheless, even if embryos lacked moral status, this doesn't mean that they have no moral value or significance at all. We might still have obligations not to destroy them because of obligations that we have towards other people or because of the symbolic value that they have, and this gets hinted at in some of the reports. These considerations would at least give us some reasons to act in particular ways towards embryos, such as using them only in worthy research activities and not in frivolous ones. In addition to discussions of the moral status of embryos and other ethical considerations that might or might not justify embryo research, some people distinguish between the destruction of embryos that are created specifically for research purposes and embryos that were created for IVF but will no longer be used for reproductive purposes. So in IVF, there often are numerous embryos created. Some of them are frozen, possibly for future transfer, but at some point some of them are either left frozen indefinitely, disposed of, or donated for research once they are no longer desired or if they're found to be defective. So the question then becomes, does it matter if the embryos are created specifically for research, or is using the sort of what are sometimes called leftovers that are going to be destroyed or just left frozen indefinitely? Are those two different things? The claim here, people disagree about how whether or not that matters. And so that's something we talk about in our report for a little bit. We consider how various views about the moral status of the embryo and the origin or the provenance of the human embryo could affect questions about human embryo research beyond 14 days. There's another important issue, though, that comes up in talking about the provenance of human embryos, which has nothing to do with the moral status of embryos and they're going to get thrown away or destroyed anyway versus we're going to create them for research. And that has to do with what it involves to create embryos for research purposes, namely what the effects on women of such a practice. Ova donors have to undergo hormonal injections, regular visits, and at least one non-trivial surgical procedure to be egg donors. The drugs and the medical interventions here carry risks, and these are not trivial risks. Some of them are quite serious. So ethical concerns about that, as well as the role of compensation to egg donors and possibly the exploitation of women in lower socioeconomic groups, also poses relevant concerns for the idea of creating embryos specifically for research purposes. So that's something else that we talk a bit about. If one believes that the creation of embryos can be harmful to women's health and that it can contribute to exploitation, these can be reasons that count against creating embryos specifically for research purposes, even if one doesn't think that embryos have moral status. Now, how strong those reasons are and what kinds of things could override them would be a matter of substantive ethical discussion. So I mentioned earlier sheaths or gastruloids. They raise a variety of very interesting questions. We have an appendix in the ethics report in which we consider some of the implications about different views on the moral status of the embryo and the 14-day rule in regards to sheaths. Sheaths do not go through the usual stages of development, including fertilization. Thus, even if we decided to treat them like embryos, it's not clear that the 14-day framework or any other framework that relied on days post-fertilization would be appropriate or relevant. How would we talk about a 14-day post-fertilization sheath? Right? It doesn't have 14 days post-fertilization. So one possibility is to focus on the characteristics that appear in the embryo and that generate the moral status concerns in the human embryo and determine to what extent those map onto sheaths. So we review the various categories in the report of the grounds for moral status, those species, potentiality, all of those, and think about how those might apply to sheaths and what that might mean, how that might translate into policy. As is the case with embryos, judgments about whether sheaths have moral status at all and to what degree they might have moral status are insufficient to resolve questions about the moral permissibility of creating and destroying sheaths. Whether sheaths have less, full, no moral status, given the context of our evaluation of the 14-day rule, it's still worthwhile to briefly think about what impact sheaths might have on thinking about human embryo research. So the availability of sheaths raises a number of possibilities. I'll point to two of them. First, someone might say, the 14-day rule should be preserved. Sheaths can provide an alternative resource for studying human embryogenesis post 14 days. Or someone might say, the 14-day limit should be constricted, since sheaths may seem to obviate the need to study embryos directly for any or for most reasons. There's other possibilities. It's likely that there are questions that research on human embryos could answer that research on sheaths could not answer, right? They don't go through the same process of human fertilization. So if we want to explore that process and study that process, sheaths won't be able to answer some of those questions. But we would need to know what would justify research on an embryo if a sheath is available. Due to the circumstances of their creation, and especially the fact that sheaths don't arise via fertilization, it may be the case that considerations about the 14-day rule simply don't apply to sheaths. But that doesn't foreclose the possibility that considerations about sheaths might influence our discussion of the 14-day rule, nor does it mean that we don't need to think perhaps separately about what kinds of procedures or oversights or regulations or rules would apply to research on sheaths in light of the morally relevant similarities. So I'll turn now to the final section of our main report. We give an overview of religious perspectives on the moral status of human embryos and the permissibility of embryo research. Religion continues to be important in the lives of many people in the United States, and as was the case with the discussion of grounds for moral status earlier, our discussion of religion does not aim in any way to be exhaustive. We focus on 5 major world religions: Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity. We acknowledge this is limited, but it also represents about 3/4 of the US population. For each of these religious groups, we note some of the differences among some of the adherents to a particular religion on views about the moral status of human embryos, and we find in this collection everything from support for embryo research well beyond 14 days to an absolute prohibition on embryo research. Our ethics report is part of a larger effort to think about public policy development regarding human embryo research. In the public policy context, compromise often plays a really important role. Policies that only partially satisfy different groups are accepted in order to move forward and in the face of irresolvable differences. And parties that are unwilling to accept any compromise at all are sometimes characterized as bad actors in the policy landscape. The 14-day rule is often characterized as a compromise or a middle path between proponents and opponents of embryo destructive research or any kind of human embryo experimentation that involves the death of the embryo or the destruction of the embryo. The current request to extend or lift completely the 14-day limit on embryo research is sometimes characterized as an invitation to opponents and proponents of embryo research to explore and forge a new compromise. But in an important sense, the 14-day rule wasn't really a compromise at all, right? At the time that the 14-day rule was adopted, as you heard this morning, in the UK, or the 14-day guideline, whatever it is, policy, rule, guideline, limitation, et cetera, in the UK and the US and elsewhere, it was not technically possible to do research on embryos even close to 14 days, let alone beyond 14 days. So when we look carefully at the trade-offs that were involved in establishing this 14-day guideline, we see that it did not limit research in any way. Right? The limits were imposed by the state of technology, and thus embryo research advocates lost nothing in agreeing to the 14-day limit. The adoption of the 14-day rule involved a compromise only for those who opposed any research on embryos or that involved destroying embryos. They gave up what they wanted, which was to prohibit the destruction of human embryos in order and set a limit. Only now that the technical barrier has been lifted and prolonged embryo research is possible does the 14-day rule really start to look like a compromise in the traditional sense of give and take and accepting things that people don't agree with to accommodate competing views. So as we consider the possible expansion of embryo research to include embryos older than 14 days, it'll be important to consider competing accounts of the moral status of the embryo, the reasons for and against embryo research, of the conditions that might or might not justify such research, and the trade-offs different policy approaches entail. There's a danger in talking about ethics in embryo research that people think, oh, this is just, your personal moral views, this is just religion getting in the way of good science, and so on. So I'll leave you with a quote about science and society that I think captures the reasons that we are gathered here and the significance of your contributions to this exercise. Facile references to politics standing in the way of good science denigrate the foundations of science and democracy alike. Science depends on a space in which it can observe its internal norms and exercise its specialized skills, but in a way that coheres with, rather than contradicts, the norms and aspirations of democratic societies in which science is embedded. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments.
Okay, so we have a few minutes for questions, and I am going to take advantage of the fact that I am here to ask the first one. So this is actually to relate the ethical issues to the policy issues. So, Anna, you have talked about all of these different views, ethical views about the moral status of the embryo, religious views about the permissibility or not of embryo research. And one wonders, why do we have to have all of these views, and in which ways this might facilitate or hinder actually policy?
So I think there's all kinds of reasons why we need to understand competing views, especially in the policy landscape, right? It simply is the case that people's various political and ethical views shape society, right? They shape our view of what kind of society do we want to be. And we ask that question all the time in other contexts that are not about embryo research. Do we want to be the kind of society that, and fill in the blank. And I think it's really important to understand these diverse points of view, to understand that they're not irrational, even when we strongly disagree with them. There are reasons that people hold the views they hold. There are grounds for which they follow a certain line of argument and come to a certain conclusion. And it's really dangerous when we disagree with each other and we start thinking, you're just completely crazy and I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to hear what your reasons are. We really need to, and I think that was one thing that for me in writing this with both of you was I really came to appreciate just how the role of certain kind of basic assumptions that science will not disprove them, right? We cannot get past certain kind of bedrock assumptions, and we need to understand what those are and what role they play. And I think it's incredibly important in a diverse society to accept and appreciate competing points of view, even where we disagree with them. And that's part of what I think we're trying to do in this report, is to say, look, here's the landscape and here's why there's so much disagreement. It's not just that somebody is, anti-science or, hates babies, right? It's much more complex than that. And I think it's really important to understand and appreciate that. And there is no reason to think that there is some bright line between ethics and science. When scientists talk about the importance of advancing knowledge, that's a moral claim, that's an ethical claim. Why is it important? It's not just because it's fun, it's important because you think it can lead to some good, right? That's a normative claim, that's a moral claim already. And I think appreciating that this is all, at some level, an ethical conversation, a conversation about ethics is really important.
Kirsten, you want to?
Well, I'm going to go to where my area is, which is a little politics and policy. So in the end, we're actually going to the government, perhaps, a way that's regulated into our broader society, asking them, we want to do these particular areas of research, which needs to be understanding of the society that you're asking from. We have a president right now that some people may or may not have voted for, but he's the person who represents us. You have legislators in Congress, you voted for one, but the rest of them are in there. But understanding where their perspectives and where their constituents are driving them will help you also be able to advocate, I think, a little bit more strongly for your particular views, and be able to understand that there are also, again, winners and losers all over the place. There's not enough federal funds to go for everywhere, so therefore science is a small portion of that in every area of science, so therefore it becomes to being prioritizing what is important, it isn't important with it. And I think as we've seen kind of like, I think in the past 10 years where federal funding, I think the scientists in the room will probably nod with me on this, or others who've applied for grants will nod with me. It's getting a little bit harder and harder to actually get funding for scientific research that's valid and good. There's a lot of stuff that's really good that unfortunately doesn't get to be done because of these decisions, and you need to get an understanding of who is talking and what are the voices when you approach these.
Okay, thank you. So let's open this for questions, and we have already a hand over there. Rebecca, please.
Thank you for the terrific overviews. That really covered so much in a clear way. I wanted to throw a couple more things into the mix that I think have been in the background, but just to highlight them. One is assuming that we have to draw a line somewhere. I mean, we could say, well, look at how much we could learn if we dissected me or you. And so I think most people say, well, no, but you shouldn't do that. I mean, even if I said it was okay, you shouldn't do that. So this came up a little bit earlier in the scientific session. Thinking about whether to get rid of the 14-day line, I think you we also need to think about, well, what would be a better replacement? And, I mean, for example, with abortion, we have viability, which, along with 14 days, I would call them cluster concepts. So there are a number of factors that you might throw into them to make them defensible. But I do think if we are to say, yes, we should change the 14-day limit, we should only do that if we think we have a better place to draw the line. And then secondly, just related to what you were saying about priorities, is it appropriate, when all of our scientific resources are limited, the time of the researchers, the number of researchers, the labs, as well as funding, how urgent is it to do any embryo research, to do embryo research after 14 days? Is it appropriate to say, well, something should have a lower priority because in addition to, there are all these other things that are also important, this one has more political, moral controversy, so that would be something that would perhaps put it in a lower priority, just to make things more complicated.
Yeah, those are great comments. Thank you. People here. Yeah, thank you. I think
You're absolutely right. Those are both really good comments, and that's part of why we're here, right? If you're going to change it, what are you going to change it to, and what would be better and more justifiable? And I think that's part of the discussion. And then the second comment was really about, prioritization of funding, something that, is I think affects the policy and the science conversation all the time.
Okay, we have a question there. Yeah.
Sure. Just two questions for the two different papers. For the policy paper, I feel like in that paper, and this isn't a critique, we're often looking for a workaround for the US federal government. So we're trying to figure out a way to work around the fact that we can't work with it, is what it sounds like to me. And it's funny what things look like in retrospect. Bush's policy looks like an actual compromise. So I'm just wondering if you could put Trump aside for a second and think about ways that might not be a workaround of I live here, government in this picture. And then for the ethics people, I can't get away from the feeling that there's too much emphasis on the moral status of the embryo in the discussion. And if we begin with the idea that we're trying to look for a compromise, we might not weigh moral status so heavily as and weigh in there quite a lot more about other ways of thinking about what's valuable or what's at stake in this kind of research, like the symbolism, which I think is enormously significant, of what we do to embryos, regardless of their moral status. So, what does it mean for us to use something that is human in origin and represents and is the earliest form of human life in research? So I just wondered if you could reflect on these other important factors that are in addition to moral status.
So I'll go with the first one,
Which was, you were asking, I actually think the Dickey-Wicker Amendment ends up being a compromise that we've created. We might not have made the decision to have that compromise, but as it progressed, we decided to keep it. We had advocates that were strong advocates for embryonic stem cells. R.A. Specter, he kept it. We have, again, Republican, Democrat, and I think this is our compromise. It's interesting, we've actually surveyed scientists, biologists, and physicists over the U.S. to ask them, what do you feel about research on human embryos? And they were mostly supportive, we'd say 60%. And then we asked about federal funding for it. Should we fund this research? It was actually higher. So, and when we looked at the public, it actually kind of sort of looks the same way in the sense that people are more accepting of funding it than they actually are of the research. But ironically, we've made this compromise within our government that we're going to do the opposite, which is this is where we're going to keep and make people from making it ultra controversial is by saying we're not using our dollars for it. And so the question then is that should there be kind of a guideline, like a 14-day rule like the UK has, or another alternative that we embed within it? I think Dr. Bovanale would say no thank you, because that isn't something he's hindered with. He is hindered in his research with the federal ban on funds. But on the other hand, if you're really interested and and you find people who are interested in funding it, you can actually still do the work. So I would actually say that was actually a compromise that we did do, where they had winners and losers with it. Unlike, I think she was arguing the 14-day didn't necessarily feel like a compromise at the beginning.
So I'll take your second question, Josie. I think you're absolutely right that there's a significant emphasis on moral status in the paper, insofar as the paper is meant to be a kind of picture of the landscape of debates about human embryo research over the last 40 years. It reflects that that's been a primary focus. At the same time, one of the reasons that we sort of decided not to scope out everything else that's relevant is we've got such a great group of folks assembled with us here for the next couple of days to really help sort through maybe, I don't want to be too normative about it, but maybe what the debates should be about rather than what the debates have been about. It'll be very interesting to open those discussions up over the next couple of days.
I want to also respond to the moral, to the focus on the moral status. And I think that one of the things that we were trying to do, obviously, call attention to the fact that this has been one of the main reasons that people use to maintain that we shouldn't do research, or that we should, whether or not the embryo has moral status. And what we were trying to do is actually to show that that question by itself doesn't tell us much, that other moral considerations, other substantive moral considerations are necessary, or practical considerations in some cases, to actually make decisions about what we should do or not with embryos in relation to research. We have one in the back, yeah.
How far back?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. I enjoyed the presentations enormously, and especially, Kristen, your walk through history on the policy-making part of this, and I'm struck by a couple of things. One is the notion of engaging publics, or the public, in this process. And Dr. Brevenlew's kind of recitation of the meetings he has hopscotched among recently, and that those meetings are generally groups of experts talking among themselves about what we should be doing here. And yet the history suggests, especially in the UK and even here in the early 70s, that engaging regular folk across the country is a way to perhaps move policy forward in a more deliberative sort of fashion. And I'm interested in your ideas about how that might happen in this context, and what we might do about it, because it can be very complicated.
Thank you. Actually, I am really interested, and that was one of the things I think you probably noticed from the presentation that I appreciated, was the differences in how they engaged the public, or thought they engaged or did not engage. I appreciate the fact that that first committee, that EAB, actually physically went to different places. They didn't rely on everyone coming to them. I think, unfortunately, we're also restrained by resources. So a lot of times you have an FDA call, do you like this thing? Everyone writes in, and then you get like thousands of people, they write the exact same thing over and over again, but you're not really sure, is that actually the public? So truly understanding, surveying the public, getting a better kind of feel for the public, I think takes a little bit more time. We tried to do today specifically so we could bring in some experts, but also left it open to anybody who's interested. This was a free discussion. We offered some snacks to maybe attract some people as well. To get you to come in and tell us what you're thinking. We also had the question card specifically created, so if you didn't get to ask your question, or didn't have the opportunity, or weren't comfortable asking it, that you would tell us either today or later. You could email us, trying to engage that way. But I know that there's more that we can do. I think there's sampling and surveying that we might get a better feel for people's ideas, interviewing of different people who are religious, not religious, different sides of the fence on these issues, to get a better feel for where they're coming from. Scientists in the past, and they're doing much better, but in the past always thought, well, if I lecture to you and explain the knowledge we're getting, you will understand and completely change your mind and then go to exactly what I'm talking about. And I did notice with biology, with embryonic stem cell research, I think the scientists realized that sometimes that worked, but a lot of times it didn't work, and that we're now learning to be more conversational. So public diplomacy is an area we do here, which is the first thing you have to do is listen. You have to listen, and then you listen a little bit more, and listen a little bit more, and then you assemble it, the information, and then you make recommendations. But the key part of actually really being thoughtful, and if you're going to be able to do anything, is to kind of listen. And so but there's a lot of more technology we have out there. I don't know whether or not it makes it easier or harder to figure out what the public is thinking, or just the people at the edges who are either happy or unhappy are thinking, and that's really hard to tell.
Okay, I think unfortunately we are out of time, or do we have one?
Kid out there. I wanted to get his question in the back row.
I have a question. You said, I think Dr. Iltis.
That's okay.
You said that the embryos that used for donations, like that SA defects, were that instead of using them for
Reproduction?
for reproduction, you said that instead of using them for research, like what are your, I guess, other ways that we could actually use them for?
Well, I was just describing the reality of what happens. So when there are embryos that are left over that are not going to be used for reproduction, or at least that the people who own them are not going to use them for reproduction, they have a few choices. They can leave them frozen kind of indefinitely. They can have them disposed of. They can donate them to somebody else who would use them for reproduction. So sometimes people talk about embryo donation, where they have donated, or embryo adoption, where they donate the embryo for somebody else to reproduce, to somebody else to have gestate the embryo, not reproduce, gestate.
Have a baby.
Have a baby. Or they can donate them for research.
Would it be better that if we use them for research so we could like actually get like in general, like the research would actually help save lives because it would like prevent.
So some people argue that, and there's a lot of people who argue that, and then that's why some people donate them for research. There are other times where people say, look, it's actually a problem that we're even creating this many extra embryos in the first place. And so rather than saying, oh, look, we did this thing that we disagree with, so now you might as well make the best of it, they say, no, step back and change your practices so that you're not doing that in the first place. So that's the debate, part of the debate anyway. Great.
Thank you, everybody. So I think we have a few minutes before, but we are done now with the panel. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Here's the-